Sorry, his name's Context.
Media.
Oh, really? He does not
Mr. Context?
He just has a one name, like really any.
It's not well known.
Good morning, everyone. I think we're going to have people trickling in. There was a discussion about whether or not we start on time or not. Thank you for coming. It's not always at Brussels events that you have good participation. I think we're going to have a really good discussion today. My name is Tom Gibson. I'm the EU representative for the Committee to Protect Journalists. Welcome. This is the launch of the Council of Europe Journalist Safety Platform Annual Report launch. We are gathered here today to go over this report, but we're also gathered because we're all deeply worried about the state of press freedom in Europe. We are seeing severe backsliding in the rule of law in countries around Europe. And we've had these type of conferences in the past where we say that journalism is at risk. Well, I mean, we all feel it. And it's this toxic mix, isn't it, of the upending of geopolitics, Russia's aggression in Ukraine, the rise of far-right populism, the spread of disinformation, surveillance, this sort of normalization of attacks on journalists. And what we do in this report is to collectively outline the important trends of the year, cases and concerns which we think need to be flagged. For those not familiar with the platform, it is a unique accountability mechanism. We have 15 partner organizations who post alerts on the platform. It's a public space. These alerts are in relation to abuses of press freedom, and Council of Europe member states need to respond in writing to those concerns. And what we want is that they respond to our alerts, but they will also tell us what they've done to address the abuse. And you're going to hear from our speakers today, but it's our 10th anniversary. And we do have solidarity, and it's good. And we have to regenerate that solidarity as a press freedom community, because more than ever, we have to be working together. We have to have a collective set of demands. And we need to be sticking up for journalists when they need us. Our work is about trying to get real action from governments and institutions. So in this vein, I'm pleased, before I introduce our panelists, to show a short video. This is a presentation from the fairly new European Commissioner for Democracy, Justice, Rule of Law and Consumer Protection, Michael McGrath. He can't be here this morning, but he offered to open with a few recorded remarks. Can we play the video, please? Thanks.
Platform. And I'm taking this opportunity to congratulate you on the 10th anniversary of the platform. Over the past decade, the platform has become an indispensable watchdog on press freedom, documenting threats and holding those in power accountable. Your work is more important than ever. Threats and attacks against journalists and media professionals are on the rise, and it's heartbreaking to see journalists facing so many challenges just for doing their job. The list of threats is long and disturbing. Physical and online attacks, especially against female journalists, unjustified arrests, spyware, strategic lawsuits against public participation, so-called slaps, and a culture of impunity. We cannot turn a blind eye. And I want to thank you for your efforts to report on these attacks, raise awareness, and prompt action from national authorities. The platform is vital for addressing journalists' safety and media freedom in Europe, and I encourage Member States to work with you to resolve your concerns effectively. You can count on my commitment to supporting and protecting independent media. As you know, the Commission monitors developments relating to media pluralism and freedom across all Member States in its annual Rule of Law report, and we use data from the platform's alerts to inform our recommendations to Member States on how to strengthen the safety of journalists. The 2021 Commission recommendation to strengthen the safety of journalists and other media professionals also uses data from the platform. I would encourage Member States to work with the Council of Europe to set up frameworks and measures on journalist safety and to ensure such efforts provide the very real support journalists at risk need. In these uncertain times, with a war on our continent and massive disinformation campaigns and attacks on factual reporting, it's more important than ever to protect the key role played by independent media and journalists. In this aim, the European Media Freedom Act is a crucial piece of legislation. I am committed to ensuring it is implemented effectively so that the rights of media service providers are protected and the information space in the EU remains free and independent. We will work to make sure Member States are ready to apply it in full from August of this year. We also prioritise setting up the European Board for Media Services so that they can fulfil their tasks effectively. We'll also focus on the timely delivery of guidelines envisaged by the European Media Freedom Act. For example, the guidelines on the self-declaration functionality to be put in place by very large online platforms for media service providers. Down the line, we'll monitor any systemic issues that may arise, and if needed, we will launch infringement proceedings to ensure that the rules are respected. And there's ongoing work to ensure the implementation of the anti-SLAPP package. Beyond all of this, the new European Democracy Shield will give a special attention to the situation of media, be it its economic viability, the safety environment for journalists, the challenges and opportunities brought by AI, as well as stepping up media literacy. And not least, we will look at actions to incorporate the role of independent media as part of our fight against disinformation. As always, we will ensure that fundamental rights, such as freedom of expression, are protected at every stage of our actions. It is a delicate balance, but we're committed to getting it right. You are vital watchdogs of our democratic systems. Your role will be crucial to keep the public informed with correct information based on facts and not fiction, and to hold those in power to account. Let us continue to work together to ensure that our democracies remain free from interference and that journalists can work without fear of intimidation or harm. Thank you.
So we're very pleased to have that statement, and we would like to thank the Commissioner for it. In order to address this backsliding, we're going to have to see more political leadership. And we're going to be renewing that message today to the institutions of the Council of Europe, the institutions of the European Union, and then all the member states. How is this press conference going to work? We're going to have two panels. We have a mix of platform partners who are going to talk about the report and the work of the platform. And we also have journalists from Georgia, Malta, Ukraine, and Serbia who are going to be talking about their work and their story. We're going to hear the presentations from the speakers, so we're going to go in chronological order. And then at 11:05, more or less, we're going to change panels. We will take questions. We look forward to having a discussion and a debate. For those people online, I have written in the comments box. I invite you to use the chat function, and please state who you are, your organisation and outlet, and make your question targeted to one of the panelists. So on the first panel, we have Nicholas Williams, who is the Policy and Campaigns Officer at Index on Censorship. To his left, we have Olga Rudenko, the Chief Editor of the Kiev Independent. To her left, Ricardo Gutierrez, Secretary General of the European Federation of Journalists. To his left, Lia Chakunashvili, Executive Director of the Georgian Charter of Journalist Ethics. And then at the end, but certainly not last but not least, Oliver Manikel, the Head of Europe Advocacy and Programs at the International Press Institute. So Nick, can I ask you to open with a short overview of the background of the report and some of what the report says?
Yes, so as Tom mentioned, this is the 10th year of the platform, and it's the 6th report that the platform has published, which brings together alerts published from the year, but also analysis to look at trends downwards and upwards of the alerts and what this means for the broader media freedom environment across European Council of Europe member states. I should also point out it does include Russian Federation and Belarus. So 3 months before the platform launched in April 2015, 12 people, including journalists and cartoonists, were murdered in Paris at the Charlie Hebdo attack. And ever since the platform has been live, we have tracked the alarming killing of journalists. Many to this day remain unsolved. So there have been 51 alerts related to the killing of journalists. Of course, many of those relate to journalists who have been killed while covering Russia's unlawful full-scale invasion in Ukraine. But we've also seen the tragic killings of Daphne Caruana Galizia and Jan Kuciak as part of their coverage of organized crime and corruption, as well as others, including Yorgos Karavais, Peter de Vries, and many, many others. And these are some of the most serious alerts that the platform has been monitoring since its inception, as well as I mentioned, the topic of impunity. Because if murders of journalists are not sufficiently investigated, followed up, prosecuted, it sends a signal to others that they can silence public interest reporting and restrict the public's right to know by killing journalists. But what we've seen over the last 10 years is an increasingly complex media freedom environment, where it's not just one tactic, it's not just one group of people, and it's not just one type of journalist who are being killed. There are very few beats that remain unrestricted through a wide range of threats, whether that is physical attacks, whether that is assassinations, whether that is online harassment and smear campaigns, the unlawful use of surveillance technology such as Pegasus or Predator, whether that is the use of slaps and other abusive legal threats aimed at stifling journalism or just preventing the journalists from carrying out their work because they have to mount a defense in court. We've seen new technologies being incorporated into this, and we'll hear later on about the use of AI to further increase harassment and online smear campaigns. Obviously, the 10 years does capture the COVID period, and the COVID period also coincided with a large increase in alerts to the platform. For example, 2022 is the year of the highest number of the alerts on the platform, and that number has remained high to this year, which you'll see in the report. The report 2024 has about the 4th highest number of alerts, but it has remained high since 2020, 2022. So we're looking at about 250 alerts per year, roughly. These are split on the platform. You'll see between level 1, level 2. Level 1 are the most serious threats. Level 2, obviously still of concern, but may not be as serious. Level 2 is about 59% of all alerts, with level 1, 41. That is an alarming statistic, in my opinion. When you have the most serious alerts, nearly being of half of all the alerts, is something that member states, the Council of Europe, the European Commission cannot close their eyes to. This is showing a serious threat across the board. The platform works at its best when member states respond, and respond substantively and meaningfully. This is not just a naming and shaming exercise. Each alert is shared with member states, and the platform partners stand ready to support member states to ensure that each case is responded to and that there is effective and meaningful remedy. This is the heart of the platform. We have seen a slight improvement with the response rates of member states to the alerts, and that is to be welcomed, but I would say cautiously welcomed, because that decrease in non-responses is not universal across member states, and there are still a number of states who do not respond. But also, it's not just the it's not just the quantity of the responses that we need. As Tom said yesterday in Strasbourg, we need quantity and quality. It's not good enough for member states just to regurgitate a press release or just to acknowledge something's happening. We need meaningful follow-up, including remedy, to ensure journalists themselves, who are the subject of the alert, to be protected, but also the sign and the signal it sends out to others to be able to continue their work. So this is something that we hope will continue to improve, but we cannot assume that decline will just happen. That decline is only going to happen with the platform, with the partners, and with member states taking their obligations and responsibilities seriously. So what the last 10 years shows is a complex media environment. As I said, there is not one perpetrator. We have seen alerts emanating from business leaders, from heads of state, from organized crime organizations, obviously in conflict zones in Ukraine through invading military forces. We've seen it in the capture of public service broadcasters, the starving of funds for independent media, the inability to access press conferences organized by states. We've seen it in courtrooms, we've seen it on the streets. Outside of the conflict in Ukraine, one alarming trend that we've seen that really emerged as a dominant force during the COVID-19 pandemic is the risk to journalists on covering protests and demonstrations. And while protests around COVID may have dissipated, a lot of other issues, whether it's the conflict in Ukraine, conflict in Gaza, domestic issues around sort of election results, corruption scandals, responses to natural disasters or other issues. We've seen protests emerge, which obviously is another form of freedom of expression, but we're seeing that being another vector of risk for journalists, either being attacked by protesters or police who are policing the protest. This is not restricted to one state. This is a universal risk that everyone should be aware of, and every member state needs to be aware of and ensure that if the threat is coming from their police, that the police are trained and know how to ensure journalists are free to report on protests. Last thing I'll end on is this idea of the broader democratic decline we're seeing across member states. As we've seen this rise of populism, far-right sort of discourse about the role of journalism within the democratic process, is the delegitimization of journalists. And you see this through online harassment and offline harassment and smear campaigns, but you're also seeing it in how the public and influential members of political parties or other institutions handling and dealing with the press. As soon as a press is delegitimized, it makes it easier for subsequent violations to be visited upon them. And this is something, again, is not limited to a country, a region. It is a universal principle and a universal concern we're seeing across member states. So the one thing I'll end in is to protect journalists. We need to ensure that every violation is followed up meaningfully by member states, but also that the role of journalism and a free press is embedded in how we understand European democracy and democracy in every member state. You cannot have democracy without a free press. You cannot have an informed populace who are then expected to make a decision about how their country is run without a free press. And over 10 years, we are seeing a splintering and an evolution and a development of the tactics being used to target journalists, and that is something that we need to be alert to. And the platform remains Europe's best tool to be able to respond to this, because we're not looking for the same type of alerts. We respond to every alert that we find, and we see this evolution of tactics, this evolution of the motivations towards attacking a journalist. So we need to be vigilant, and the platform is that vigilance made manifest. Thank you, and I'll pass on to Olga to talk about her experience in Ukraine.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I'll talk a bit about the experience of our team at the Kyiv Independent, but also about the experience of journalists in Ukraine in general. And I was trying to, as I was preparing, I was listing the threats to media and media freedom that Ukrainian journalists have, and I stopped at four main ones, four sectors with bullet points for each one. As you all know, the first and most immediate threat to media in Ukraine is coming from Russia, naturally. It's a physical threat. It's the threat of extinction. Several dozen of Ukrainian journalists have been killed since the start of the full-scale war. A lot of them were killed because she was killed in Russian captivity. And I say she was killed because even though it was initially reported that she died, there is now evidence that she was tortured while in captivity. And it is pretty obvious now that she died not from natural causes, but from many, many months of torture. She died 5 months ago, and her body has not yet been given to her family. And there are reasons to believe that is because Russia wants to conceal the evidence of torture. And her case is very, very important and very telling because Victoria was a 27-year-old Ukrainian freelance journalist who risked her life to go to the occupied territories, to the territories of Ukraine occupied by Russia, to report from there. And as you might know, it's extremely hard to get any information about what's going on in the occupied territories. We are very careful when we get information from there. It's usually through some intermediaries who are talking to people there, and they know safe ways of communication, because it is dangerous for people for people who live in the occupied territories, even to have certain applications on their phone, like if they have Signal, for example, like that's if their phone is checked in the street and the Russians see that they have a phone app for secure communications, they think maybe this is because they're talking to Ukrainians. And it is extremely dangerous to anybody there to share anything with Ukrainian journalists. So we are very careful when we obtain information from there. It usually comes from, as I said, either through intermediaries, or we talk to people who have just left occupied territories, who have fresh information about what was going on there, but their own life is no longer in danger. And and Victoria wanted to shed light on what is going on there in this in the places that are so hard to be at and so closed off to the world. And Russia made her pay for this. Because to Russia, she was an existential threat. She was a journalist who was trying to tell the world how Russia is really treating people in the occupied territories. So Russia made her pay for that. And it's a reminder, I think, especially now as we're talking about negotiations and concessions to Russia and about conceding territory to Russia. The big thing that is often missing from this conversation is that it's not just about land, it's not just about territories, it's about people there, and conceding territories to Russia means subjecting people to torture, means basically death sentence for many, many people who will go through Russian torture chambers, of which there are plenty in occupied territories. And it's very important to remember about it now, as Ukraine is being pushed into considering concessions to Russia. Another way, of course, that Russia has been a threat is through attacks on Ukrainian territory. And somebody asked me just now before this panel how the situation is in Kyiv. Is it quiet now? Actually, I think you barely read about this anymore in the news, but there is an air attack on Kyiv every night in the past few weeks, every night, no stop. It's usually a drone attack. And usually all of the drones are intercepted by air defense, but not always. And it is so, it's almost like it's on schedule. It's about 10 p.m. every night. Sometimes we're still in the office when it happens. And we're so used to it that nobody even goes to a shelter or anything like that. We barely interrupt our work or our meetings. So we hear the loud explosions in the sky from when the drones are intercepted, but we barely even react to that now. But that's Kyiv. That's Kyiv because Kyiv has air defense. In other cities like Kharkiv, Kherson, it's much worse. And it's much more difficult for Kharkiv, Kherson, Sumy, Zaporizhia, some of the cities that suffer very much from air attacks of Russia every night. And as if this was not enough, there is also the internal pressure, internal threat to journalists coming from bad actors in Ukrainian government who see the war as a convenient pretext to try to limit media freedoms. And they have limited some media freedoms since the start of the martial law, but a lot of those limitations are reasonable. They have something to do with the military, such as not reporting about the exact number of troops and so on, which is fine, which is reasonable. But there are people who are trying to use the war to basically brand any criticism of the government as a Russian narrative. So when you're writing about corruption, you're pushing a Russian narrative. When you're writing about something bad happening in Ukraine, even though it's completely true and it deserves to be reported, people in the government say that this is helping Russia, and we should actually wait on all of that until the war is over, which is something that independent media in Ukraine don't share this view, obviously. Even there has been a number of attacks on journalists, attacks meaning pressure, unjust limitation of access to government events, to comments from the government. Some journalists have been targeted by draft, meaning they were drafted to the military or they tried to be drafted to the military in connection with the stories that they did as retaliation. And there have been cases of illegal surveillance of journalists by government agencies. What's important is that in all of these cases, they were usually the pressure was usually administered by the people directly reporting to President Zelensky. And these cases continue. There are still some, even for us, for example, we are Ukraine's biggest English media outlet. And I get emails from our readers almost every day saying, please pass it on to Zelensky. Usually their strategies for winning the war, or some advice or whatever. Believe it or not, but before the meeting in the Oval Office, I actually got an email from a reader saying, I have a feeling that Zelensky needs to wear a suit tomorrow. I can show you the email, I'm serious. I had an email from a reader saying, I think he needs to wear a suit, it will make a difference. And then, you know what happened. So people have this impression that because we're so big, we have such a huge international audience, we have like a direct connection to the president, we can ask him questions or pass on advice. Well, in reality, we barely get invited to press conferences and briefings because we're not controlled, we're not loyal enough, we don't sugarcoat what we write, and we stay independent. So that's an internal threat. One thing that is mentioned, I think, in the report in connection with the Kyiv Independent is a lawsuit that we've been facing, that I personally have been facing from a former Ukrainian official who doesn't live in Ukraine anymore because he was connected to some pro-Russian people, so it's not apparently an ideal situation in Ukraine for him now, but he has such a sway over Ukrainian court system that he sues every journalist who writes anything critical about him ever, and he always wins. Like when he filed a lawsuit against me over a Kyiv Independence story, our lawyer told me, okay, we are losing the lawsuit. We are losing the appeal, that's for sure. We have a chance in the Supreme Court. So we're in for several years. That's the reputation that this person has. And we indeed was the first instance, and they were now appealing the decision. So, and finally, the last thing I wanted to mention, a big, in all these cases of pressure on journalists, a big difference was made by Ukrainian allies, by the embassies who have come together in Kiev, listened to journalists, and tried to make a case to the Ukrainian government and administration. Helpful, but this effort in many cases was led by the US embassy in Kiev. Historically, they have been a big, very helpful in defending freedom of speech in Ukraine, historically. As we all know, the United States is taking on a bit of a different vector now, which also undermines as one of the side effects, one of the many side effects, is that I'm not sure that Ukrainian journalists are going to have this ally anymore. And of course, the way that US aid was cut abruptly, I think it was a month and a half ago as of this point, right? A lot of Ukrainian independent media, they had their funding cut overnight. And for some, it was 30–40% of the budget. For others, it was 90% of the budget, just cut overnight. And they have no way to replace this money quickly. And so these are the three vectors, the three directions from which the threats are coming for Ukrainian journalists now, from Russia, from inside, and now from the US.
Thank you. I'd like to focus on one of the key findings of this annual report, which is the rise of what I would call the mass targeted violence against journalists in Europe. This mass violence manifests itself through armed conflict, war, but also through what is known as transnational repression, which targets in particular journalists in exile, often Belarusian or Russian journalists. As you've just said, Olga, many of these journalists now find themselves in a drastically precarious position as a result of the freezing of American cooperation funds allocated by US aid or the US State Department. The war in Ukraine has had this consequence. Ukraine is the country that recorded the highest number of alerts in 2024, 40 alerts, of course, most of them related to Russian-occupied territories or attributed to Russian forces. Some independent Russian journalists are also victims of this war. Victims of censorship, victims of draconian laws criminalizing journalism. By December 2024, at least 29 Russian journalists were imprisoned. 6 of them are behind bars on charges of disseminating so-called fake news or discrediting the Russian army. On the Ukraine side, in December 24, the Parliament, the Rada, debated a bill proposing 8-year prison sentences for publishing confidential information during wartime. And we know as journalists what this kind of law could be misused to target journalists, in particular investigative journalists. You'll see in the report that at least 5 Russian journalists in exile were targeted in 24 by Russian criminal charges or Russian investigations designed to intimidate or discredit them. All of them have been targeted with charges related to their reporting on Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And this year, we are devoting a chapter in the report to a new phenomenon linked to the growing number of journalists in exile in Europe, mainly, as I said, Belarusian and Russian journalists, transnational repression. The fact is, some authoritarian governments no longer hesitate to target journalists across borders, as was the case in 2018 with the murder of Jamal Khashoggi in the Saudi consulate in Istanbul. In 2024, the platform recorded the stabbing of an Iranian journalist in London. But transnational repression does not only take the form of physical attacks. The most common form is surveillance, which has targeted Bulgarian and Russian journalists in particular. Some governments also abuse Interpol alerts to have a journalist arrested, as happened to the Belarusian journalist Andrei Gnot, who was arrested in Serbia at the request of the Belarusian authorities. Also to the Azerbaijani journalist Afgan Sadigov, who was arrested at the request of the Azerbaijani authorities. This is really worrying. I just discussed it before the press conference with our affiliates in Belarus. Some governments, there is now a kind of alliance, collusion, I would say, between governments to repress journalists by using legal instruments, security instruments. And that's rather new in Europe. That's commented in the report. I will conclude with what you said, Olga, the situation of many journalists and media in exile or media opposing authoritarian regimes was already very difficult in Europe. For some, it has become dramatic since President Trump's decision on 20 January to freeze thousands of USAID foreign assistance grants and awards, including funds allocated to Ukrainian and Belarusian media. But this will probably be part of the next annual report.
Thank you for this opportunity to speak. And as we speak, my country continues to descend towards autocracy at a high speed. I have witnessed final years of Soviet Union. Then, a journalism student, I was full of determination to fight it and full of hope that it would never return. 37 years wars, revolutions, and many ups and downs later, I find myself, together with colleagues, in a standoff with the Georgian supporters of a bloodthirsty tyrant who wants to bring it back. First time since the dissolution of Soviet Union, we have a female journalist, a prisoner of conscience, in jail on fabricated charges. A judge yesterday left courageous journalist and media manager Mzia Maglobeli in detention, dismissing up to 50 pieces of evidence submitted by Mzia's lawyer. 7 policemen gave false testimonies against the journalist, and she now faces from 4 to 7 years in prison for something she has not done, an attack on police officer. A light slap she gave to the police officer was a symbolic gesture and an emotional response to humiliation and degrading treatment she was subjected to. Mzia Maglobeli's case shows well the extent of lawlessness in the country, with brutal police not accountable to anyone and with judiciary corrupt and controlled. Mzia is in jail because who she is as a professional and as a human being, a person of high integrity, true to her principles and her calling, who would not bow to any pressure. While in police custody, Mzia was subjected to ill treatment. To protest the injustice, she was on hunger strike for 38 days. things are so bad in Georgia that we fear that from April we will not have any independent media outlet or NGO left in Georgia. We fear that soon we critics of oligarch Bidzina Ivanishvili will either be locked up in a prison or will be forced to flee the country. Georgian Dream, which usurped power in Georgia after forging elections in October, is about to adopt legislation which will effectively outlaw any dissent. Georgian media will lose access to financial assistance from Western donors. National communications, which will NGO leaders and media managers who will refuse to register under Foreign Agents Registration Act will face 5 years in prison and heavy fines. Georgian Dream government, which increasingly viewed media and civil society organizations as adversaries, introduced a Russian-style law on foreign agents first time in spring 2023 and then again in spring 2024. Government propaganda worked on full stream to stigmatize, marginalize, and discredit journalists. They were threatened and attacked verbally and physically. Their offices, houses, and cars were vandalized. Georgian Dream did adopt the law, but shortly after, irritated by resistance, decided to replace it with a more repressive one, which would target not just organizations, but also physical persons. When on November 28, Georgian Dream announced that they were pausing negotiations with the European Union, people poured to the streets of Tbilisi to protest. Since then, they do so every day for 97 days already. Georgian Dream suppressed the protest with a cruelty we have not seen in Georgia before. Police severely beat up hundreds of peaceful protesters. They used water cannons, tear gas, and pepper spray against citizens, many of them youngsters who felt that they were being robbed of their future. On the first night of protests, police has attacked over 35 journalists. The attacks were not incidental. Police singled them out and beat them up in full knowledge of who they were and what they were doing at the site. In the following days, in addition to police, groups of muscular men dressed in black with their faces covered, so-called titushkas, attacked journalists, some of whom narrowly escaped death. Journalists, both men and women, were hit and kicked, predominantly in head and face. Their noses and facial bones were broken, and many were diagnosed with brain concussion. Their equipment was smashed and stolen. In a matter of 10 days, over 90 journalists were obstructed from doing their work. After exposure to chemical irritants, which police used to disperse protests, many journalists reported lasting effects on their health, such as unexpected bleeding from the nose, breathing difficulties, and headaches. It was only later that we learned that Georgian Dream was brainwashing police units, including riot police, for years, cultivating hatred towards journalists and benefiting from the expertise of Belarusian instructors. To date, none of the attackers were found or punished. Policemen in Georgia do not wear any number so as they can be identified and brought to justice. Cynically enough, the very journalists who were hospitalized with serious injuries were summoned to the courts for disobeying police order and now face heavy fines. As if beatings were not enough, Georgian Dream decided to financially pressure journalists through heavy fines. Journalists are prosecuted while on a reporting duty for artificially blocking the roads during protests. Oligarch Ivanishvili once said, referring to a critical TV station, "The minute you turn it off, it will become apparent to everyone that the country is blooming and flourishing. We should not let him to live his dream. In a world full of problems, please don't give up on us. And as Mzia said, fight before it's too late. Freedom to Mzia and to all prisoners of conscience."
Thank you. I have to say it's really sobering and humbling to be sat on this panel, listening to you, Leah and Olga, about the situation in Ukraine and Georgia, and it goes to show how, despite the geopolitical turmoil that we're facing, Europe absolutely must not give up on our colleagues in these countries. If we give up on journalism in Georgia and Ukraine, what hope do we have that our leaders will protect journalism inside the European Union? This is crucial. Look, I want to focus on a country a bit closer to home, Slovakia, which for 2024 is probably the country within the European Union that has suffered the most rapid deterioration in press freedom. There too, journalists are operating in an extremely hostile political environment, subjected to smears, to disinformation campaigns, to harassments, to threats, and there remains the ongoing problem of impunity with the lack of, with still the failure to fully convict those responsible for the murder of Jan Kuciak and his fiancée Martina back in 2018. But what we've seen in 2024 is that the government has also sought to emulate the strategy of media capture that has been perfected by the Fidesz government in the neighbouring Hungary. Now, media capture consists of four main actions: the political takeover of public service media, the political takeover of media regulators, the misuse of state funds to reward government friends in media and to punish government critics, and the misuse of government influence to facilitate the takeover of private media by their political business allies. And Slovakia's government has targeted all four of these instruments in 2024. Most dramatically, it closed down the public broadcaster, not for long, just for a day. In fact, all they really did was to change its name, change its legal status. And why did they do that? In order to empower the government to immediately fire the Director General Luboš Mačaj on the 1st of July, and then to be able to impose the government's own allies onto the supervisory boards of the public broadcaster and therefore secure its political takeover. Secondly, Robert Fico, within weeks of becoming Prime Minister at the end of 2023, threatened to withdraw state advertising from independent media, singling out the most important and most credible private news broadcaster, Markiza TV. Only 3 months later, in January 2024, Markiza saw a crisis in its newsroom as journalists protested against changes of editorial practice which they claimed or believed were implemented as a result of direct government pressure. Markiza denied this. Nevertheless, most commentators have detected a softening of the news agenda, and the crisis has certainly damaged the station's reputation. What is clear, though, what is absolutely evident, is that the government has sought and continues to seek to intimidate Markiza and all the other independent media through economic measures. Meanwhile, there are no instruments for ensuring the fair and transparent distribution of state advertising, so it is impossible to verify how state funds are being used to reward or punish media to create a pliant media environment. Thirdly, the Penta Investment Group, which is a very large financial company that's closely allied to the Smer governing party and which used its media to campaign heavily for Smer during the 2023 elections, has since expanded its media stable by purchasing the largest tabloid newspaper, Novi Čas, giving it near full control of the country's tabloid market. Now, this development reduces media pluralism, but it also fulfills the government's aim of ensuring its allies dominate the media sector. Lastly, in November, the government announced plans to reform the structure of the media regulator so that in future, all major decisions will be taken by one person, the president of the board. And the rest of the board, the 9-person boards, its role would be reduced to hearing only appeals against those decisions. Now, such a structure, if implemented, would make the regulator much more directly dependent on the government who appoint the president. Now, somewhat ironically, in the justification of these reforms, the government cite the European Media Freedom Act and the need to come into alignment with the European Media Freedom Act to do this. Of course, the reforms do exactly the opposite. So what is to be learned from this? As EU member states roll out the European Media Freedom Act and introduce measures to tackle media capture by improving the independence of public media and regulators, by ensuring transparency of ownership and the distribution of state funds, and introducing media pluralism tests for media acquisitions, the European Commission must be absolutely vigilant that this process is not abused and that governments do not simply comply with the letter of the law, but also the spirit. EMFA has the potential to be a game changer in protecting media pluralism and editorial independence across Europe. But to succeed, firstly, the EU must demonstrate the political will to robustly challenge governments that fail to comply. And secondly, the media community, stakeholders, you, us, it is up to us to maximise the use of this new regulation to hold our governments to account and the EU to impose the standards set out across Europe.
Thank you very much. And I would like to also reiterate the comments made by Oliver about Olga's presentation and Leah's presentation. What we want to do with this event is bring the voices of journalists to the discussion. We're here to defend them. I want to now create as much space and time as possible for questions. We have received a couple online, and so give the audience a bit of time to think about the questions you would like to ask. The first question is from Renate Gensch, who's a member of the National Board of the German Journalists Union and member of the Freelance Rights Expert Group of EFJ. Can you answer why only Sweden and Switzerland, which, as you know, is not part of the EU, still have no action plans for the safety of journalists in the 27 member states, even though it was already discussed in 2015? What are the reasons? I'm going to give Nick a second to think about that. We have another question as well. From Samantha Agra, why was Italy chosen as one of the countries in focus? And I'm going to direct that question to Riccardo, if I can. Now, whilst they're thinking about responding, do we have a couple of questions from the audience? We'll have the man here first, and then at the back there.
Thank you very much. I'm Roland Papp from Népszava, Hungary. And I have a question, about Hungary and the Sovereignty Protection Authority, which has been established. Officially, their role is to protect Hungary from foreign interference. But what we've seen in practice is that they've been, looking into the work of media outlets. And what do you think about it? How do you evaluate that? And also, what can any institutions or you do about it to protect the journalists and their independence?
Good morning, Mark Dempsey from Article 19. Firstly, congratulations to Tom for organising today. It's nice to see such a show, despite the external, very sobering circumstances. My question's a very broad question, and I see most of you aren't in the Brussels bubble, but I'd love to hear broadly what you think we as advocates in the Brussels bubble, so to speak, could be doing something differently now that we've reached these sort of unprecedented times where really there is a lot of work in the Brussels bubble, but some of it's less coordinated than it could be. But what topics would you think that we should really focus on going forward?
Thank you very much. If I can just do a little bit of moderation here with the Hungary question. Oliver, if you could take that up. And I would invite all the three other panelists who aren't part of the Brussels bubble to respond to that last question. Thank you.
Yes, so I mean, I'm in Glasgow, so quite far from the Brussels bubble. I'll talk very briefly about the action plans raised by the question. I think it's a really interesting, so people may know the Council of Europe has the Journalists Matter campaign, which was launched about 2 years ago, 2 years ago or so, that encouraged the formation of action plans, committees, focal points to encourage there to be a dialogue between the Council and Member States, but also to coordinate Member State action on protecting journalists. It was launched in Riga and it's been rolled out ever since then. I will say there is a drastic need for more Member States to take up this campaign to establish these action plans and working groups, not just to satisfy the campaign, but to give that sort of shape to how they respond. And you know, I don't want to be too doom and gloom, even though obviously my presentation was pretty heavy both on doom and gloom. There have been some really interesting examples, you know, so Perschvelig in the Netherlands, which has also now, I believe, been emulated in Belgium. A number of other sort of strategies. There's a tool in the UK where I'm based, set up by the National Union of Journalists to allow for alerts to be lodged. And a number of countries that are responding in different ways, because obviously there's not one way Member States can respond to these concerns. You know, we always encourage Member States to learn from the expertise they have in their country, both from newsrooms, journalists, freelancers, but also trade unions, which I think she was part of, the German trade union, and obviously with EFJ's membership across the Member State. There is a lot of expertise and knowledge, and these focal points and action plans can help bring that together, add direction, and also direct state attention. It's not just enough for trade unions and civil society and journalists to be talking about it. We need there to be more coordination with Member States. So while I think very cautious as to the opportunities that this campaign does afford, it needs to be taken seriously by Member States. I believe there's only about 7 action plans established across Council of Europe Member States. That's not sufficient. Many of those were actually established before the campaign. So again, we've been calling for Member States to take this report seriously, and they need to take this campaign seriously, because there has been progress. We have the EU Anti-SLAPP Directive currently in the transposition stage, and we have the Council of Europe draft recommendation on SLAPPs. Well, not draft, sorry, the actual recommendation on SLAPPs. So there's been progress on certain topics, and obviously we're talking about MFER as well. This also needs to be matched by these structures that can be put in place to ensure that journalists are protected. In terms of the Brussels bubble question, one thing I think is always really important is ensuring voices like Olga and Leah are part of the policy discussion. It's not enough just for us, you know, to talk about it. Journalists are their own best advocates. You know, we can support in, scheduling meetings, knowing how the systems work, but ensuring that it's not just us talking on behalf of others, that journalists can advocate for themselves. Because we have seen, you know, countries like Greece, for many years was not a country of significant concern, but we've seen over the last sort of 5 years that status changed drastically, and obviously Oliver's also talking about the situation in Slovakia. So that would be my recommendation. Sorry.
It's okay. I'm going to have to do a bit of moderation. That we'll answers should be about 2 minutes if we can, because we've got the next panel. Olga.
Off your mic.
I can try to give a brief answer on the Brussels bubble. So first of all, I have no idea how Brussels bubble works. I'm very far from it. I'm extremely confused about the whole setup of all the EU bodies and everything. But a couple of things from what I know. So from the challenges and threats to Ukrainian journalists that I listed, obviously the Brussels bubble can't do anything about Russia. But with the US aid freeze, I do think that Europe needs to step in and try to replace some of that, and as much as possible. There's already some EU funding, EU donors, funding some independent media in Ukraine, but the problem is that they can't move quickly. They can't step in quickly to replace the funding that media outlets lost because of the cut of the US funding. And if there is any advocacy that can help them moving faster, maybe to set up additional emergency funds for them, that would be great. Just to clarify, I'm not a great independent media in Ukraine, investigative media, local media, the kind of media outlets that are the heart of their community in the places that are targeted by Russian attacks every day. They are now in extreme danger of shutting down just because there are no funds. And the second thing, when it comes to monitoring internal pressure on media, pressure coming from the Ukrainian government, about a year and a half ago, I was in Brussels for some event, and I was talking to, again, as I said, I'm very confused about the setup of bodies. So let's say I was talking to an official in one of EU bodies who was monitoring media freedom in Ukraine. I'm not even trying to conceal his identity. I just literally don't remember. But he said something very interesting. He said, we know that in Ukraine recently, there was this very big investigative story that was published about corruption. And he knew the story. He knew the name of the journalist who did the story. And he said, we are watching closely what's going to happen to him in the next few months. We're focusing on this case. He knew exactly the journalist. He said, I'm going to be watching what happens to him the next few months because this is going to be an indicator of the state of freedom of media, like whether there is going to be retaliation against him. And I thought that's an extremely smart and useful approach to the situation, to focus on a specific case. And it was indeed very smart because several months later, indeed, there was retaliation against the journalists. There was harassment. It became a very big scandal in Ukraine. And so that person knew what he was doing. So I think that was a very smart approach. Thank you.
EU bubble question. We are based in the Residence Palace, the European Federation, so we are in the heart of the EU bubble, but I live constantly outside the EU bubble because the European Federation of Journalists is a member-based organization, and we have 74 member organizations, unions of journalists and associations of journalists in 44 European countries. So I'm constantly in contact with them, and be sure we are really connected with the ground, I would say. Why Italy? We decided, the whole team, the 15 partner organizations of the platform, to focus on 3 countries. Why these 3 countries? Slovakia, Italy, and Georgia. Because we simply noticed a huge increase of the number of alerts related to these countries in 2024. So it's just a signal coming from the statistics. There are particular problems in these countries, and we decided to dedicate 3 chapters, national chapters, to specific countries in the report, which is not common. We've been doing so in the first and second report 10 years ago, and then we stopped. But we thought it was time to come back to a national approach because there was some problems. And in Italy, we have still now 50 active alerts with very serious cases of physical attacks against journalists, but also a capture from the state, media capture, in particular RAI, the public broadcaster, is really under threat, not only about its independence, but also its funding on the long term by the government. So that's the reason why we decided to focus on Italy. Recently, we have a big spyware scandal the Paragon spyware scandal, which will be part of the next report, I believe, as well. So these are, in a few words, the reasons why we decided to focus on Italy, but also Slovakia and Georgia.
I will say what I think we need from you. We need your help to keep Georgia on the agenda. There are so many competing issues, competing priorities. And without you, it will be very difficult for us to succeed. When USAID froze funds, we lost not just money. We lost a staunch supporter. And today we have in the audience a person who has managed in Georgia the biggest USAID program. And they were our hope that they will help us with legal issues. They would give us moral support. And now all of that is gone, so we need your attention. We need you to keep reminding European institutions and others that certain things are happening in Georgia and the worst is yet to come. Also, maybe you could talk to EU donors and also to individually to member states to allocate more funds to Georgia. We understand that it's impossible to replace funding we lost to fill the gap because it was a lot, it was huge, but at least to fund some key media outlets, many of whom depended almost 90% or even more on foreign funding, including USAID funding. So thank you. That's our request.
Quickly, because I know we've got a time. Hungary. Hungary, what can we do to solve the problem there? I mean, look, EMFA in many ways was designed to solve the problem of media capture in Hungary. The problem with EMFA is it's not a cure, it's more of a vaccine. It's more of a vaccine to prevent media capture. It can't cure it. And the trouble with media capture, especially after 15 years, is it's entrenched. And it would take a generation to undo the damage that has been caused. We talk about the propaganda of the public broadcaster and the use of of finances that are focused onto that, and how advertising is also directed to the media conglomerates that are allied to the government, particularly through KESMA. And we see how the independent media, who do an extraordinary job in Hungary at sort of keeping the flame of independent journalism alive, but they are absolutely squeezed economically. And this is the biggest challenge. And we know that many of those have been it's also severely hit by this USAID freeze. So these are all really big problems. But I think, and this then goes on to Mark's question as well, very briefly, if there was one issue that I think we need to prioritise over the coming years, it is solving the economic the failure of the economic market that props up media. If we cannot solve that, in the face of, the monopoly of advertising by the platforms, with the threat of the next wave of AI that's going to come through, if the EU cannot enforce the copyright directive so that content producers are being adequately compensated by the platforms. And if media just reliant on public funds, we see there's an important role for public funds to support journalism as a public good, and it is there because of the market failure. But that is also not a cure. It is simply a sticking plaster. The only way, it is absolutely the biggest priority, I think, for the next 5 years for the Commission. If we can solve that economic problem, the economic viability of media, if we cannot solve that, then we are finished. As a sector.
Well, what a way to finish this first panel. I unfortunately have to again play my role as moderator and thank the panelists. They've done a really fantastic job, especially the external speakers. We're going to have a minute's pause, and I'm going to invite the second panel to come on and replace them. But yeah, if we could have a quick show of appreciation for our speakers. Thank you. We could, okay. We'll do that at the end, okay. Yeah, you have, okay. It doesn't matter. Hold on. Corinne, you're here. Julie, you're here. Dinko, you're in the middle, and then Emma and Fluter at the end. There we go. All right. Okay, can we... All right, I'd like to get started for the second panel, if we could, please. You're here. Thanks. All right. Okay, if everyone could take a seat, please, that would be fantastic. We're going to move... Hello, everyone. Can you please take a seat again? Thank you. We're going to start the second panel. The first speaker is Corinne Vella, sister of Daphne Caruana Galicia, who is also the head of media relations at the Daphne Caruana Galicia Foundation. Julia Majeshak, head of Brussels office of Reporters Without Borders. Dinko Gruhoncic, journalist lecturer at the University of Novi Sad, Serbia, and also program director of the Independent Association of Journalists of Vojvodina. Emma Bergman, senior policy and advocacy advisor at Free Press Unlimited. And then Flutura Kusari, a senior legal advisor at the European Centre for Press and Media Freedom. We'll have the same structure as the first panel. Corinne, I'd like you to begin if you can. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you, Tom. I'm just going to put on my timer just to make sure I keep on track. There isn't a lot of attention on Malta these days, and if you look at the Council of Europe Safety Platform, it actually seems to be doing quite well. I checked it. There are no alerts this year. It's still early. There are none in 2024, and there are low numbers for other years. But it is one of the countries in Europe where there is a case of impunity for journalists' murder. That was my sister, Daphne, and her murder happened in a time when there was a lot of democratic backsliding, verging on state capture, if not absolute state capture, and very little scrutiny. Because it's small, because it's in the south, because it's out of sight. All of that could happen practically sight unseen. I sort of think her case is, emblematic still for what could happen in Europe, and how it's also an example of how continued scrutiny remains important. Although there are very few alerts on the platform, it doesn't mean the situation is okay. There is still impunity for Daphne's murder. There are 3 people awaiting trial. One has been granted bail and is out in the streets. The political rhetoric against the media is increasing. Politicians are undermining mainstream media by ignoring their questions, denying access to information, refusing FOIs, prioritizing practically any means for, addressing their audience other than by responding to mainstream media that actually hold them to account. There was a public inquiry into Daphne's murder, but nearly 4 years after the report, the recommendations have not yet been implemented. It was an historic opportunity to transform for Malta to transform itself from the country known for the bomb blast that took Daphne's life to being a country recognized for the response to its trauma. And if anyone's paying attention, that response is not very admirable. Only last week, the Prime Minister discredited the public inquiry. It disputed the report's finding that Malta was becoming a mafia state and that Daphne's murder put a brake on that process. And he rejects the recommendations of the board on the need for Malta to have anti-mafia legislation. Those are part of a package of recommendations that concern rule of law to address corruption and organized crime. Malta has transposed the anti-SLAPP directive of the European Union, which itself was inspired by Daphne's experience and is known as Daphne's law. But the transposition is the barest minimum. It ignores the Council of Europe recommendation on SLAPPs, and it ignores the EU recommendation on SLAPPs. It also, legislation ignores a lot of other recommendations on journalist safety. There is no action plan on journalist safety in Malta. Essentially, Malta's version of Daphne's law would not have protected Daphne herself, but our government is fond of boasting in international circles that Malta was the first to transpose that directive. And unfortunately, Malta is being looked at as an example of how quickly you can move, but there's very little attention on what standards are being implemented there. There are questions, we need to question, I suppose, the assessment of national measures that are being put into place by the government. You know, the anti-SLAPP directive is one of those things. It doesn't provide any protection in domestic cases. On terms, there's been a lot of talk here of democratic backsliding. It comes back to something that you will know through experience, that journalists are the proverbial canary in the coal mine. When things are going wrong for journalists, it signals that things are going very, very wrong. But with so many bad things happening in so many places and that a lot of attention being shifted from one area to another, there is a risk that a process that could be arrested before it becomes state capture could actually become state capture itself, and where there is actual agency and intent rather than accidental backsliding. I think I should stop there, right? Because I'm running beyond my limit. Yeah, just a few seconds short.
Yes, I'm going to put timing and put timer as well. Oh, I can. Yeah, I think this one is better. Thanks. So I'm going to focus on giving you the main takeaways from this year's report concerning threats, violence, and harassment against journalists. As we have already heard here, practicing journalism is getting riskier, and this is the case even in countries that aren't at war. Journalists face more physical and verbal attacks, threat, and harassment. This trend is not just concerning, I think it is alarming. In 2024, the report highlighted 78 alerts out of 266 attacks on journalists' physical safety and integrity, compared to 52 the year before. The highest numbers of cases were recorded in Ukraine, driven by Russia's war of aggression, followed by Georgia, Serbia, and Turkey. Aside from acts of war resulting from Russia's aggression against Ukraine, most physical attacks on journalists were related to reporting on public protests and elections. Covering demonstration and riots remained particularly risky as some protesters see journalists as enemies of the people. We saw this in Georgia. The country had the sharpest rise in alerts in 2024. more than threefold compared to the previous year, and largely due to attacks on journalists during pro-EU protests. Journalists have also been the target of police violence in Georgia again, which presented an especially troubling example of police brutality. Dozens of journalists experienced verbal and physical assault during pro-EU protest. But it's also the case in Azerbaijan, where journalists the platform also published 32 alerts covering journalists who were not targeted, even if they were targeted, even if they were not on assignment. They were assaulted or even shot at, like the Turkish journalist Azim Deniz. And the other massive concern is harassment and intimidation. In 2024, 77 alerts focused on harassment against journalists, with Russia topping the list with 16 cases. And as you can, I guess, imagine, much of this harassment now occurred online. We had this campaign in Denmark that was exposed by newspapers, saying that thousands of false advertisement campaigns targeting journalists on Meta platform. We also see that in many cases the involvement of politicians and friendly media outlet further exacerbate the situation. It is the case in Slovakia, where Prime Minister Fico called the media bloodthirsty bastards. It was the case also in Serbia, where two journalists, TV journalists, were subjected to a torrent of online hate instigated by politicians from both the ruling and the opposition parties. We have also seen for the first time the first cases of AI-generated manipulation. So AI-generated disinformation campaigns are now part of the harassment toolkit. It was the case in Slovakia again, where a deepfake audio clip was released ahead of the election involving a well-known journalist, Monika Todova, and a politician leader. Everything was fake, but was massively shared on social network. And another case was in Serbia, where a deepfake disinformation campaign was launched against journalist Stevan Josinovic. Sorry for the pronunciation. Yes? Okay. One word as well, if I still have time. Not really. Yes. So the war in Gaza has also reverberated across European street and newsroom, and the platform documented numerous cases of harassment and threats against journalists covering this crisis, with incidents reported in Sweden, Denmark, Germany, Italy, and the UK, to quote some of them. I'm trying to go to the main things I wanted to say. Maybe one word about more direct attempts to intimidate journalists and also organizations like Reporters Without Borders. We have been a victim of cyber attacks targeted by a Russian disinformation campaign, using a fake BBC-branded video falsely quoting RSF using our logo, our visual identity, and also images of our advocacy director. This campaign was amplified by pro-Kremlin influencers. We have been targeted by several videos exploiting our logo and our reputation. We have signaled it, but we have also filed a criminal charge against X for failing to remove the false content. So it shows also the problems to fight when you are attacked, because most of the social networks don't reply to the signalements. Maybe one very quick word on impunity. Daphne Caruana was, the assassination of Daphne Caruana Galicia, I think, was a huge shock in the EU. I started working for RSF a bit before, and since then we've seen other assassinations, and there is still no full justice for these murders of journalists, which remains one of the most heinous attacks. We've seen this year a few acquittals in Greece, in Poland, in Serbia, and I think this sends a very dangerous signal. The culture of impunity not only silences critical voices, but also undermines public trust in justice system and emboldens for further violence against the press. I'm going to stop here because I know that I'm already too long. Thanks.
Good day to everyone. I come from Serbia, a country where student and civic protests against the corrupt authoritarian regime have been ongoing for months. Hundreds of thousands on the street demand justice for 15 victims who died when the canopy of the newly renovated Novi Sad railway station collapsed. The regime responsible for the project tried to cover up its role, sparking mass outrage. When it comes to independent journalists in Serbia, the regime considers us one of its greatest enemies, given that almost all the institutions in my country are captured. I personally have that, on the quote, privilege, that I have been declared the state enemy #1 by the regime and its media, which use black war propaganda against journalists and activists. I have been target of this propaganda for a year now, almost daily. The campaign began with Putin-style propaganda methods. They use a deep fake video to portray me as a supporter of war criminals. This was a particularly cynical attempt to destroy my professional integrity, since I have dedicated my entire journalistic career to fighting against historical revisionism and advocating for a culture of remembrance. Death threats were graffitied on our building, first seen by our teenage daughter. I have received hundreds of direct death threats, mostly through social media, as well as thousands of the most brutal chauvinistic insults. Even our son has been targeted by the regime propaganda. The state has done absolutely nothing to prosecute even a single case of these threats. Serbian President Aleksandar Vučić, along with other high-ranking regime officials, almost daily labels me a traitor, the leader of the opposition, and the organizer of so-called color revolution, that's their term for the citizen anti-corruption protest, and they attacked me on ethnic ground also. This is why at one point I had to leave Serbia for a month and a half, thanks to donor support. Thanks to the European Federation of Journalists, I also had private security for 4 months. I moved through my city, Novi Sad, very cautiously because I face verbal attacks and insults on the street. Recently, the offices of the Independent Journalists Association of Vojvodina were yet the police failed to identify the perpetrators, even though we provided them with security footage clearly showing their faces. We interpret all of this as a clear message from the regime that we are not safe anywhere. Our association president, Ms. Ana Lalic, is in a very similar situation, including attacks simply for being a woman. Ana Lalic is the only journalist in Europe who was arrested during COVID pandemic in April 2020 for reporting on poor hospital conditions for both patients and staff. This happened after the regime attempted to impose media censorship. Our colleague Tamara Skroza from Belgrade was also subjected to a month-long hate campaign and targeting. The regime was not deterred by the fact that she is a single mother and in poor health. Local journalists are in the hardest situation in Serbia. In a country where out of 170 municipalities and cities, only in one, believe it or not, Vučić Serbian Progressive Party is not in power, the few professional local media outlets that remain are constantly exposed to threats and pressures. One example is the small local outlet In Media from Inđija, a town halfway between Belgrade and Novi Sad. The outlet's editor, Ms. Verica Marinčić, has faced physical violence. That media outlet has faced the highest number of slap lawsuits at the local level. On a national level, the most targeted media include television stations, N1 and Nova, a daily newspaper, Danas, few weeklies, a few internet portals, especially the Sezolovka news portal, as well as investigative portals like Krik, Birn, Cins. The Istinomer portal, published by CSO Crta, faced an attack when armed police raided Crta's offices, allegedly to investigate their contracts with USAID. Similarly, the police raided several other CSOs in Serbia using methods previously seen in Russia and Belarus. Notably, regime-affiliated media reported on the police raids even before they occurred. Amnesty International has reported that Serbian institutions use software capable of unlocking mobile phones, extracting their content, taking screenshots, and activating cameras and microphones. These tools target activists and journalists. All media in Serbia that report professionally are under attack by the regime, and they are very few in number. Research shows that out of approximately 2,500 registered media outlets in Serbia, only about 80 adhere to journalistic code of ethics. As independent journalist from Serbia, I strongly believe that by advocating for freedom of media, we are also standing up for the fundamental values of which the European Union is built. Unfortunately, at the same time, we must point out that certain officials from EU countries have remained silent for too long about the terror we are subjected to by Vučić's regime. Therefore, we urge them to immediately put an end to this harmful practice before it is too late. And at the end, I just want to show you this is the symbol of our citizen protest in Serbia, and this is also kind of alert. Also the symbol of protest. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you, Dinko, for talking to us. It has been brought up by a few speakers already today, and what I want to highlight today is the issue of the use of spyware against journalists and the surveillance of journalists by using spyware. This has been a significant concern for us since the spyware scandals in Greece and in Hungary in 2021 and 2022. But we see that in 2024, it continues to pose a very severe risks to independent media. Because of advances in technology, spyware is increasingly difficult to detect and is being employed more and more, not just by authoritarian governments, but also by democratic states. We've highlighted in the report a few examples, and I want to name a few of them. We've seen, for example, instances where 7 Russian and Belarusian journalists in exile in different Council of Europe member states, where their phones were infected with spyware. Another concerning development was the conclusion of the investigation in Greece of the Predator Gate scandal. We saw there that the government whitewashed the role of the security services and instead is prosecuting the journalists that are reporting about the Predator Gate scandal and the investigation, targeting them with SLAP, strategic lawsuits against public participation, but also with police investigations and other threatening acts. The European Media Freedom Act addresses some of the concerns that we have for spyware, for example, by only allowing it in exceptional cases against journalists and making sure that it has to be authorized by an independent authority like the judiciary. But the text unfortunately falls short of really ensuring that there are adequate protections. Because of ambiguities in the text, states can use it, for example, by invoking national security as a reason for using spyware, which sets a very dangerous precedent and is not in line at all with the higher standards that were set out by case law through the European Court of Human Rights. I also want to give a few notes of hope and maybe signal a few good practices that we're seeing in Council of Europe member states. As Nick already mentioned, the Journalists Matter campaign for the safety of journalists was launched in October 2023, which aims to promote effective engagement by Council of Europe member states for the safety of journalists. We've seen since then that 20 member states have established national committees to coordinate efforts on the safety of journalists, and 12 member states have either action plans or are working on setting up action plans for the safety of journalists. And we also see on an individual level in member states that there has been some progress made. One of those is the Persveilig initiative in the Netherlands, where I'm from, which monitors journalist safety and supports journalists when they're at risk. This has ensured that, for example, the police more quickly investigates crimes against journalists, but also that higher sentences are being given to perpetrators of violence against journalists. The Persveilig initiative used to be a temporary program by the Dutch government, but has now received permanent subsidy. So this is a very positive example for journalist safety. Another example is in Luxembourg, where the government introduced measures to increase penalties for crimes against journalists and has also increased the capacity for the police to investigate violence against journalists. And for example, in Norway, we're also seeing that there's increased funding for media outlets in rural areas to ensure diverse local media representation. So there are some positive developments, but there's definitely more work to be done. And I just want to end by saying that safeguarding journalists and the safety of journalists is not just for their individual rights. It's for the survival of independent and investigative journalism. And this, in turn, is not just crucial for journalism itself, but for democracy as a whole. Without decisive action for the safety of journalists, we risk further eroding one of the fundamental pillars of democracy, which is a free, independent, and fearless press.
Thank you. Tom, how many seconds do I have?
You sum up.
Yes, very briefly. Welcome. Thank you very much for attending our conference. I'll cover very briefly SLAPs and abusive legislation. On SLAPs, we've been discussing this topic since Daphne Caruana Galizia was assassinated. We knew before that there were problems with how lawsuits were used against journalists, but we became aware only after Daphne was assassinated because of the number of lawsuits that she was facing. What we did over the years is we documented the level of SLAPs being used across Europe, and once we realized that this was a European problem, then we advocated with the European Commission, Council of Europe, and the European Parliament and other European institutions for instruments and legislation. So what you'll see in the report is that we've mentioned the fact, and we welcome the fact, that we now have 2 instruments in place, the EU directive against SLAPs and the Council of Europe recommendation against SLAPs. But what we need and what we're appealing today to member states of the Council of Europe and the European Union for the transposition and implementation to take place. and not for the sake of taking place, like we had the case in some member states, like Malta that was mentioned, but we want the transposition and the implementation of Council of Europe standards to be meaningful and to include especially civil society experts and to have a proper legislative process in place. We're appealing to member states to put in place capacity building programs. There are very good and effective programs of Council of Europe on training judges, lawyers, prosecutors on how to deal with cases of freedom of expression, including slaps. So we're hoping such programs will be used across Europe. From our side, as civil, we have issued 3 reports covering more than 1,000 cases in Europe, and we will continue to do so. And we're hoping soon to launch the European Anti-SLAPP Monitor, which is a tool that will monitor how member states within EU and Council of Europe are transposing these standards. So this is on SLAPP, but I also want to use the opportunity to thank Corinne Vela and Daphne's family for helping civil society in Europe to advocate for these instruments. I don't think we would be able to have an EU directive and a Council of Europe recommendation without Daphne's family. We are forever grateful to the work that you've done. On abusive legislation, very briefly, the new trend, unfortunately, is to use foreign agent laws against media outlets and civil society in general. Laws should be there to protect individual rights, to ensure justice, but we're seeing in many countries now this new trend of abusing legislation, especially by putting in place or proposing foreign agent laws. Today, civil society organizations issued a reaction on the recent piece of legislation in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Please read it if you have time. But we've seen initiatives in Slovakia, although they have not materialized yet, in Serbia and in other countries, how these legislation are being proposed. And they have a very clear purpose. They want to stigmatize all those working in the 4th pillar, media, civil society, etc., as spies, as foreign agents, as someone who are not contributing to public interest matters, but they're doing the opposite. They want to add as much administrative burden, because this legislation comes with obligation, and sometimes for small media outlets, it's simply not possible to keep up with the requirement, and they want civil society organizations and media outlets to live under the constant threat of fines, which ultimately can end up in some media outlets being even shut down. So I conclude by saying, from our side, we will continue to monitor, especially and to react when abusive legislation is put in place. But at the same time, we want to welcome the recent ruling of the European Court of Human Rights against Russia on foreign agent laws, which have put some good standards in place. Thank you.
Absolutely. So we're now coming to the final part of the discussion. I'm going to open up the floor to questions. Do we have any more? The 2 questions at the back. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll introduce myself just in case most of people know me. My name is Elena Chernevska. I work actually as EU advocacy for the RFS, an Azerbaijani founded organization, and I am lucky to know most of you. My question, first is a bitchy comment, and then an honest question. The bitchy comment is what I appreciate. This is massive work, but I was slightly grated by the fact that most of examples come east from Vienna, as we used to say in my previous employment, which is the OSCE. I think west of Vienna, there are enough examples which should be mentioned. And tying into what you, Flutura, said, I think I frankly see the implementation or discussion of foreign agents law, it's very limited. It's also limited to a particular geographic area. But what is a lot more difficult are and I think threatening, is the use or abuse of national security laws against journalists. And that is not precluded either by the SA or the EMFA. And I know it's difficult, but I think something should be done about that. The honest question is, would the platform consider doing anything in terms of specifically highlighting safety of female journalists? Why I'm asking? Because all of you, like all of this brilliant panel, has had one or two examples specifically covering women. And I think this is so urgent. And now the RFOM somehow is slacking in that. There's the RFOM. They used to have it very high, but I haven't seen much coming from their part. So maybe it's time for the platform.
Directly. Hello, thank you very much. Nora Würstelt, Human Rights House Foundation. Thank you very much for the presentation today. We at HRHF also cover freedom of expression in Eastern Europe, and I think many of the things you reported are not only true for journalists, but also other human rights defenders. I have a question. As the platform, and you represent the platform here today, besides being an important monitoring body and space, relies on state replies to the alerts you're covering at a time, though, when many Council of Europe member states aren't committed to their obligations or disregard their obligations as Council of Europe members, including Azerbaijan, Georgia, Serbia, Turkey, you also talked about today. So what, from your civil society perspective, can the Council of Europe do more to pressure states to respond to the worrying trends you presented here today?
Do we have any more questions from the room? Perhaps one more before I hand over to the panelists to talk through the issues. Who would want to jump in first? Perhaps, Flutura, we could go from this end.
So, taking Nora's question, yesterday we had a very good meeting with the Secretary General of the Council of Europe, where we exchanged so basically we presented the report, and also we had a very good exchange, and this was one of the topics. So from our side, of course, as civil society organizations, we're limited in terms of documenting what is happening, trying to get as many responses from member states, not only in terms of written responses in the platform, but actual actions. But we do need the Secretary General, we do need member states to react. So yesterday, the conversation was about how we can intensify the, let's say, positive pressure on member states, and lots of ideas were discussed, which we'll follow up. And before we agreed on those ideas, I'm not going to mention, but generally we want to engage more with member states. And this is basically what we can do. We can't do more. We can go to member states at national level, at the European level, at Council of Europe level, to ask them to react, especially when we have cases of journalists who are being physically beaten, cases of impunity. So this is something that we try to address as much as possible, but in the end, we depend on political will, and we see some countries reacting better and some countries not being very, very active. But I want to conclude by saying that the exchange with the Secretary General was very good, and we have high hopes that we have his support to put. The word pressure is not the right one, but to engage more with the member states of Council of Europe. And on Olena, thank you very much for, not for the first part, but for the, for the second one. We do monitor all types of legislation that have an impact on media freedom, including national security laws. I refer to foreign agent laws because of limited time, but you will find in the platform quite a lot on that. But I do agree with you that more is needed. Thanks.
Thank you. And I would actually like to address the question of female journalist safety to our external panelists. Because, Corinne, you have talked about the threats that Daphne faced during her life. And a lot of those attitudes are still prevalent in Malta. And Dinko, I think it would be very good if you could talk through, as Serbia now is in this sort of period of uncertainty with these huge, enormous pressures on journalists. How do you see the pressures on female journalists? And are people providing enough support locally as well?
So on threats to female journalists, yes, you're very right, it is a problem. Daphne herself recognised that her gender was part of the problem of the attacks that she faced. It's not to say that there isn't the same kind of, there isn't hostility towards other journalists, there is. But yes, in Daphne's case, very, very definitely, her gender was a factor. And I think it would be a good idea if somehow the journalist safety platform would flag that up, because it would be recognized, you know, visually as...
I mentioned some examples of threats against my female colleagues, and they are under attack just like me, and because of the same reasons, and also because just they are women. And it's not only a situation by journalists, but it's also like with activists and with students. So the most targeted person, if you talk about student movement in Serbia, is Mila Pajic, and she is also a young woman. She's 22. And it's a nature of such regimes. You know, we are still in some kind of patriarchal society in Serbia, but you know, those are just, you know, guys who will always attack women just because of the patriarchat, but because they think they are weaker than men, which is not true, of course.
I'm going to try to whiz through, thank you very much, I'm going to try to whiz through some of the questions that we have online, and I'm actually going to ask a platform member to also intervene on a couple of questions. We have a question about the situation in Azerbaijan, which, as we know, we've seen a wave of arrests, and the crackdown is only getting worse. And Emil Bagirov from the Voice of America Azerbaijani service has said, given that statements and calls for reform have failed, what other concrete actions should be taken to achieve real impact? And Julie, if it's all right, I'm going to perhaps apply a bit of gentle pressure on perhaps you and or Emma to think about that. The other question that we have is in relation to the USAID freeze, which clearly prevents a crisis for independent media. And in a very disappointing move, we've then seen an announcement of substantial cuts made by the UK government on foreign aid. And this is a question from Sarah Wright, who says, any thoughts to share on the risk of EU countries or the European Commission reducing its aid, the ODA budget, in the light of the current situation, i.e. that they're going to have to increase defence spending? Will Europe actually step up, or will it be forced to step up? And again, Emma and Julie, I'm going to pick on you if that's all right. We have a question from Politico, and we have Mark Dempsey from Article 19, who I'm going to invite also to respond to the question that has been raised, and it's about the, if you bear with me, the Digital Services Act, and about how effective it can be to fight online harassment of journalists, which is mentioned in the report, providing some detail and examples. But also that we do mention in the report this growth of disinformation, including that which is now generated by AI, and what more can the EU institutions do to combat this? That's her question. So, Who would like to start?
So on Azerbaijan, I have to admit that it's very difficult. I mean, this kind of regimes, and it's not the only one, it's very hard. But I think we have to keep raising our voices. We have to keep talking about journalists who are in prison. We have to keep denouncing what the government and the regime is doing. This year, we have at Reporters Without Borders choose a journalist in prison to be our emblematic figure for and have on Azerbaijan. So we will keep talking about all the atrocities that are going on in the countries. Yes. Concerning the funding, the US aid suspension, yeah, this is also critical. And we've heard already the EU saying that they can't replace the US. We also know that in several countries, like Netherlands, for example, who was a big funders, it's gonna go down. So, unfortunately, I think that yes, we can't be optimistic, but we have to each time we meet with EU officials, talk about it and. Yes, give them a clear picture of the risk and remind them that if they don't defend media and help this media, well, democracy is in danger more than ever.
Thanks, Julie. Maybe just to quickly add on the US aid and State Department suspension of funding, I think the concern is very real. Indeed, as Julie also mentioned, it doesn't just happen in the US or in the UK. We've also seen it recently in the Netherlands, cutting down ODA funding, but also human rights funding significantly in Germany as well. We also see with the multi-annual financial framework of the EU, for example, that there are concerns to what extent media will be taken into consideration for the next funding framework. And I think one way in which we're trying to also tackle this and trying to advocate for the importance of independent media is also together with the combating of disinformation, which I think is a priority for many European member states. But in order to combat disinformation, into which so much money goes, I mean, only Russia already invests so much money in disinformation campaigns by itself, we need a lot more investment in independent media and making sure that people continue to have access to reliable information. So I think that's what we're really highlighting.
Take the microphone.
The camera's right here. So, I mean, it's a good question, and I think speaking on behalf of Freedom of Expression Organisation, first there has to be a proportionate response, which abides by international freedom of expression standards when enforcing the DSA. But in terms of specific provisions, I think the most impactful ones could be the ones around trusted flaggers, which is Article 22 DSA, orders by national judicial or administrative authorities for online platforms to act against illegal content, that's Article 9 DSA, and the notice and action mechanism, Article 16 DSA. There is also what is known as the Good Samaritan provision, which is Article 7, platforms' obligation to inform law enforcement authorities about suspicions of criminal offence. There is also Article 18 of the DSA and the risk governance framework through Articles 35, 35 and 37, which could all play their part in detecting and combating systemic risks of freedom of expression and harassment of journalists. For the political reporter that asked, by all means get in touch. I know you're not in the room, you're online.
Thank you very much, Mark, for that impromptu requesting of information and coming up on stage. We're coming to a close now. I want to really thank you for coming today. I want to, again, if we can have another round of applause for this panel. They're absolutely exceptional. You know, I feel that we are in worrying times. We're all of us concerned. We wake up on a daily basis trying to work out how to get through to the end of the day. But at least what we can do this morning and today with the advocacy is to unite and try to send positive messages to the institutions that we want change on press freedom. Do share the report, do promote our messaging, do contact us if you have any questions, reach out about the alert.
Hello, just quickly before everybody goes, I mean, we heard earlier about the case of Mazia in Georgia, who's been in detention for 2 months and was on hunger strike for 5 weeks of that. Yesterday, the court hearing ruled that she must stay in pretrial detention. We are going to conduct a quick photo. Outside, we have a little poster saying "Free Mazia." So that's for the platform members, but everybody else here, if you can hang around for 5 minutes, we will take the photo outside and you can join the campaign. You don't have to, you can just report on it. We'll take a photo outside. And then I think afterwards we've got, I'm looking at Adrian now, then the platform members come back in here for an internal meeting. Is that correct? So if we start, we'll meet outside in 5 minutes. Thank you very much.